Leg day. I'd say it's the hardest day in the gym. You have to be willing to push through when it gets hard. In today's video, I'm not going to tell you how to make your leg day any easier. I want to give you a few tips on how you can better target both your hamstrings and your glutes while you're training legs. To keep it pretty basic, the main function of your hamstrings when they're contracted is to flex or bend your knees, which would bring your feet towards your butt, just like you do in a leg curl exercise. The main function of your glutes, as well as another function of your hamstrings, is to extend your hips, just like what happens when you're on the way up out of a squat or a deadlift, or just like when you're getting up out of your seat. The first exercise we'll be doing is a seated leg curl. I really like a seated leg curl because it basically cancels out everything except for your hamstrings. So you imagine the difference between this and a lying leg curl is that it's far less likely that you can incorporate things like your lower back. For instance, you see in a lying leg curl often the hips raise up quite high off the pad and then the legs come through. That's showing us that we're going from our lower back first and then using our hamstrings. So we can see here on the seated leg curl, with everything fixed in position, it's pretty much only our hamstrings that can do the work. A couple of tips for the seated leg curl is to obviously set yourself up first. So bringing the knee pad down to touch the knees, making sure the back of the seat is forward enough that that knee pad is just behind your knees, but obviously not all the way up your quads. And then with that ankle pad, I prefer to have it slightly higher up the calf instead of right down by the foot. To me, it just feels a little bit more comfortable and it's easier to control that weight. We want to set ourselves up in good posture and make sure that our lower back is touching the back of the seat rest. Then from there, we'll push our knees up into the knee pad and then we're going to bring our heels down. As we bring our heels down, we'll squeeze or pause for a second at the bottom, just so we're controlling it and getting a good contraction in the hamstrings, and then we'll slowly bring it back up for roughly 3 seconds. At the top, it's important that you don't fully lengthen your legs or completely lock out the knees. I just think that if you do that, then it puts a lot of load and a lot of tension in the connective tissues, like the tendons and things. So I like to keep just a soft bend at the top, so then the hamstring is lengthened, but we're not getting into those tendons and putting any unnecessary load through them. Our second exercise is barbell back squats. Barbell back squats are an exercise that I haven't included in my training split for quite a long time. So right now I'm going through a period of focusing on building my strength and increasing technique and my range throughout the movement. In this video, it was the first time that I'd hit 150 kilos in quite a long time. I'm not completely satisfied with my technique. I think my depth could do with a bit of work, but now that I can do the weight, from here I'm going to focus on getting more depth and more range in the movement. I find giving out general tips for a barbell back squat or most squatting movements quite difficult because a squat seems to be an exercise that incorporates a lot of variability from person to person in terms of mobility, whether that's ankle, hip, knee, spine, as well as that people's hip structure varies quite a lot, whether you've got a deeper socket or a shallower socket, or things like flexibility of certain muscle groups can make it harder or easier for you to squat. So for the tips for squats, what I'm going to do is basically explain the things that I'm focusing on when I'm squatting to better target both the hamstrings and the glutes. And then if some of those tips apply to you in your training, that's good. And if they don't, I wouldn't be overly surprised because there's that variability factor, but we'll jump into it nonetheless. The first step to your squats is to unrack the bar. Now I think it's good practice to unrack it with your feet in your squatting stance instead of in a split stance with 1 foot forward, 1 foot back. I just think that's the better option, because having 1 foot forward and 1 foot back to me seems like a less stable or a weaker position, especially when that weight gets a lot heavier. So unracking it with both feet and then simply pushing your hips through to lift the bar off, I think is good practice. Now, when you're walking that bar back, ideally, I think it's best to take as fewer steps as possible. I personally go for 1 step, 2 step, and then on that 3rd step, evening the feet out, ensuring that 1 foot isn't further forward than the other, so they're nice and even. And then taking as fewer steps as possible means that you're wasting less energy, and at the end of your set, especially if you're really tired or your legs are really fatigued afterwards, you don't have as far to walk in to rack it back up. Once you've got your feet set and one isn't in front of the other and they're nice and even, you want to take a big breath in and brace your core so that you're nice and braced and your spine is supported. To make the squats more about the hamstrings and the glutes, what we want to do is prioritize the hip flexion. So what that basically means is that we want to prioritize pushing our hips back in order to stretch hamstrings but recruit more glute, especially when we get to the bottom position and push our way up. The reverse to this is something like maybe a front squat with your heels elevated, or a safety bar squat with your heels elevated, something where you're prioritizing the knee flexion. When you prioritize the knee flexion and get more knee flexion over that hip flexion, that's when you're going to start to recruit more quads. So today I was training hamstrings and glutes, so I'm aiming to push those hips back. It's important that you keep your spine nice and neutral. So what that means is you're not rounding or flexing your spine, whether that's your upper back or your lower back, is commonly known as butt wink. And also you're not overly hyperextending or arching through your spine. We want to see it relatively neutral. One thing that I do that helps me keep my chest up especially and not roll forward is to push my elbows forward, because what I find is that by driving the elbows forward, it helps lift the chest up. You do see a lot of people, especially powerlifting and stuff, where the elbows are back, and I don't know, I suppose that works for them too, but when I'm thinking about keeping a good posture, I find that pushing my elbows forward helps a lot. And as you increase the weight and bump it up, we want the technique to stay the same. So like I said earlier, me getting up to this 150 was my top set. I'm still not overly satisfied with my depth. It's not terrible, but I think there is a bit of work to improve on. So instead of bumping up the weight next time, I want to go to 150 again if it feels good again, and then try and increase the depth a little bit. Our third exercise is a high and narrow leg press. High and narrow is in terms of your foot position on the leg press plate. We go for a high and narrow because it, relating back to what we said earlier in terms of hip flexion and knee flexion, if we're in a higher position like that, then we're not getting as much knee flexion, so that means it's more similar to a squatting movement with the pushing of the hips back, or even like a Romanian deadlift movement where we're able to get more stretch in the hamstrings and also able to get a little bit more glute, but this one mainly is about the hamstrings. For our setup, we want to make sure that our lower back is on the pad and our upper back and head is on the pad. I don't think it's overly crucial if your head comes on or off, but I think it's good practice to keep your head back because then you're less likely to cave down. Then from there, obviously, we're setting up our feet, so we want them quite high and sort of about hip width apart on the platform. So not touching, but not excessively wide. And then we'll push it up, unrack it, slowly lower it down. We're not going for maximal depth here because we're trying to think about the stretch of the hamstrings and not necessarily how low can we bring that platform. So we're coming down, feel for the stretch in the hamstrings, and then we'll drive it back up. This hamstring and glute day was pretty short and sweet, so this is our fourth and final exercise, and the exercise is a Dumbbell Romanian Deadlift. You can definitely use a barbell as well, and I kind of use them interchangeably. I don't necessarily bias one over the other. Today, or in this video, I just decided to use dumbbells instead of a barbell. This movement is surprisingly complex, and I think its complexity stems from the fact that it's very similar to a conventional deadlift, but very different at the same time. And when we start to see a conventional deadlift combined with a Romanian deadlift, we don't really get a good byproduct. The main difference between the conventional and the Romanian deadlift comes down to the knee position and the knee flexion. Ideally, we want to see the shins basically staying straight the whole time, because if we see the shins and the knees start to come forward more, then we're going to lose that stretch in the hamstring. So we start off at the top of the movement, good posture, and then we're going to push those hips back. It's not necessarily about the hands and the torso coming forward, it's actually about sending those hips back. Like in our squat, when we push those hips back more, that's when we're going to get our glutes and our hamstrings. So if we start the Romanian deadlift by pushing the hips back and slowly lowering the dumbbells and the torso down, and we're trying to find that stretch in the hamstring and keep it. So we're coming down, searching for that stretch, and when we begin to lose that stretch and the torso keeps coming down, that's when we need to stop. Like in our leg press, it's about the range of movement for the muscle group and not for the exercise. It's really tempting just to take those dumbbells or that barbell down as far as we can, maybe to touch the floor or touch our toes. But if we do that and we lose that stretch and the tension in the hamstrings, and we start to see the upper back, the mid back and the lower back start to get involved, then we've taken the movement away from the hamstrings and it's all of a sudden become more of a back movement. So when I'm doing them, you see that I might go just below my knees with my hands, but I'm pushing my hips back as far as I can, and I'm trying my best to leave my knees in the same position. Ideally, it's all coming from the glutes and from the hamstrings. I hope you learned a few tips there that could help you in your own training. And if you liked it and you want to see more, feel free to subscribe, and please do give me some feedback too. I'm still very much in the learning stage of this filming and editing and deciding on what to say and what I shouldn't say. So if there's anything that I could improve on or anything that you liked, feel free to let me know. Thanks so much for watching.